This is not going to be a full or even a partial review of the new Garmin Varia RearVue 820 bike radar. You can easily find excellent reviews done by GP Lama and others. This video is mainly to discuss the issues and flaws I have experienced with the 820. The features unique to the RearVue 820 is what Garmin described as the advanced vehicle tracking. According to Garmin, the 820 is able to differentiate between vehicle sizes, see when a vehicle changes lane, adjust the threat levels of vehicles, and keep track of vehicles traveling at the same speed. The current generation, Gen 1, of bike radars are only able to keep track of objects traveling at the same speed behind you for a very brief moment before eventually dropping off. So this same speed vehicle tracking feature on paper sounds really awesome. I have been using the RearVue 820 for the past month, and unfortunately, some of the issues I encountered are not exactly awesome. But before I go into detail with the issues, let me first describe my test setup. Most of the tests that I've done were in comparison with another bike radar, since I only have access to the previous generation of Garmin Varia radars like the RTL 510 and RTL 515. That's what I've been comparing the RearVue 820 with. My primary test rig is an extra large 2023 Santa Cruz Stigmata with a RockShox Reverb Access dropper post. The tires are 40mm Schwalbe G1 RS Pro. The bike radars are mounted on a HSU aluminum twin mount adapter attached to a saddle rail mount. The bike radars, when mounted, measure between 820 and 830 millimeters above the ground, which is within Garmin's acceptable range of 250 to 1200 millimeter above the road. The radars are also at least 100 millimeter above the top of the rear tire. To capture the rear footage, I used an Insta360 X4 360-degree camera attached to a SWAT compatible mount on the saddle. During the tests, the RearVue 820 was paired with a Garmin Edge 1040 Solar bike computer, while the other radars were paired with a Garmin Edge 840. In addition, I've also been testing the RearVue 820 with my 2019 Specialized Venge. On my very first ride with the RearVue 820, I immediately encountered two issues. The first issue is unique to the RearVue 820, most likely a consequence of its ability to track same-speed objects. Whenever I ride across Lake Washington on the 520 trail, it's guaranteed that I will encounter persistent false positives. I call it the persistent Ghost Rider because it usually appears as a small object. Occasionally, it appears as a medium-sized vehicle. I have not seen this type of persistent false positive being reported elsewhere, so I might be the first to document and report it here. At this point, you might be wondering perhaps the presence of another radar right next to the RearVue 820 might have played a role in the persistent false positive. So yes, I did the same test on the same route using just the RearVue 820, and the persistent Ghost Rider appeared kind of like your drunk uncle who showed up uninvited repeatedly. The second issue I encountered is also false positive related, but this issue is not unique to the RearVue 820. And again, this happened on the 520 trail at a section of the trail right before and just after the tunnel under 92nd Avenue. On this section of the 520 trail, the south side of the trail is exposed to the westbound road traffic. When riding eastbound through this section, I frequently get false positives of fast-moving vehicles, which in theory shouldn't be occurring because I am actually going against the flow of traffic. I think the false positives result from the radar signals bouncing and reflecting off the metal bars on the guardrail. These signals then hit the oncoming vehicles before returning via the same paths back to the radar. This type of false positives affects both the RearVue 820 and its predecessors. Some may argue that the persistent false positives on the 520 trail is somewhat a rare and unique situation that may not be applicable elsewhere. But unfortunately, I have also encountered false positives away from the 520 trail. During one Sunday's ride, I did a clockwise loop of Mercer Island. For those who are not local to the Seattle area, the Mercer Island Loop, when done either clockwise or counterclockwise, offers you 10 miles of uninterrupted, relatively quiet road between a stop sign and a traffic light on either end of the loop. For this reason, it is one of the most popular cycling roads in the Seattle area. But anyway, back to my ride. Somewhere on East Mercer Way before the final hairpin turn, the RearVue 820 alerted me to the presence of a vehicle, if existed, should also have appeared on the Edge 840 that was paired with a RTL 515. A post-ride review of the footage revealed that there was no sign of any vehicle behind me. Prior to this, the RearVue 820 had actually reported another false positive when I was riding through the Eastland neighborhood, but unfortunately, the screen recorders on the bike computers and the 360 camera were not active. When I first started testing the RearVue 820, it was on firmware version 6.34. Garmin released firmware version 6.70 2 weeks ago, and in the changelogs, only the first item had the potential to address the false positives that I have been encountering. I have since done extensive tests with this updated firmware, and unfortunately, the persistent false positives in the previous firmware version remain in the latest version. One of the main complaints of the 820 among cyclists riding in groups is the constant triggering of the radar threat mode. Radar threat mode is a feature available since Garmin's first bike radar to temporarily change the taillight flashing pattern with the goal of catching the attention of drivers behind the cyclists. Because of the new ability now to track same speed vehicles, cyclists riding behind you often showed up as threats. In all Gen 1 radars, they are only able to track same speed objects very briefly, if at all, and therefore radar threat mode is less likely to be triggered by drafting cyclists. But because the RearVue 820 is able to track these same speed objects, the radar threat mode is constantly being triggered by people riding behind you, and some of them are not happy campers. The second item in the changelog of version 6.70 is reduced false high threat alerts in certain close range scenarios. Unlike the previous version of the firmware, I can verify that I have not seen the occasional high threats persistent false positives that used to appear. However, this does not mean that the radar threat mode is any less active than before. The radar threat mode engagement remains exactly the same as before. That is, as soon as an object is tracked by the RearVue 820, regardless of its size and threat level, the taillight goes straight into radar threat mode until the all clear signal is given. In Garmin's user forum on its Varia radar, many are not happy that their RearVue 820 are annoying others riding behind them in group rides, and some have also expressed displeasure of the detected cyclists constantly appearing in the radar overlay on their bike computers. The suggestions ranges from giving the option to completely disable same speed tracking to only disable same speed tracking for cyclists while still allowing the radar threat mode be engaged for vehicles traveling at the same speed. Changing the light mode to Peloton is one way to address the RearVue 820 blinding other cyclists when radar threat mode is engaged. In Peloton mode, the intensity and pattern of the flashing LED is significantly less aggressive than in all other light modes. Another way is to disable radar threat mode using the Varia app. One inconsistent thing about the RearVue 820 is vehicle sizing. Here I was on the Westlake Bike Trail. The detected cyclist initially appeared as a medium object before quickly changing to a small object. It was able to keep track of the cyclist and maintain its size while simultaneously tracking a few vehicles on a parallel street. Frequently, cyclists initially appear on the radar as medium-sized vehicles. As the cyclists approach within 50 meters or so, the 820 changes the size from medium to small. In this example, the 820 was able to determine the size of the object from quite some distance away. On some occasions, though, the RearVue 820 was incorrect in identifying the size of the objects that it's tracking. The cyclist remained a medium-sized object the entire time. Here's one example where the RearVue 820 failed to correctly assign the proper size to the cyclist. Throughout the entire encounter, the cyclist remained a medium-sized object. When there's another M Plus light device in the same network as the RearVue 820, if the light network is set to auto, the Edge bike computer sometimes changes to individual when it's trying to search for all the M Plus light devices. This can happen when turning the bike computer on, when waking up the bike computer from sleep, when one M Plus device has left the network, or after saving an activity. This doesn't happen when the RearVue 820 is the only device in the light network. The second bug that has been happening to me is the looping radar errors that usually appear after I've saved an activity, but it can happen any moment. Sometimes the error goes away on its own, but most often than not, I have to power the bike computer off to stop the errors from repeating. Between the two bugs, this one is easily the more annoying one. Prior to the RearVue 820, older Garmin Varia radars like the RTL 515 have widely been considered the gold standard in bike radars. They are reliable, there is no false negative, and unlike a number of competing products in the market today, there are very few false positives. So here's the $300 question. Is the RearVue 820 able to meet the high standards set by its predecessors and therefore is worthy of an upgrade? Between the persistent false positives that consistently happen to me on the 520 bridge, the seemingly random false positives that I was only getting on the RearVue 820 but not its predecessors, and the unreliable vehicle size determination, it feels to me that the 820 is kind of half-baked. I don't find the brake light feature all that useful because it generally only engages a couple of seconds after hard braking. To view the vehicles being tracked in different lanes will require me to take my eyes off the road, and I don't know how that's supposed to increase my safety. I have reported most of the issues that I've experienced to Garmin, but I have no clue if the persistent false positives will ever be fixed in a future firmware update. And because you should be buying a device based on what it is capable of now and not what you hope it will be someday, it may not be worth the $300. You might argue that the persistent false positives on the 520 trail is not really a safety issue because it only occurs on a multi-use trail with no vehicle traffic. I would counter argue that this annoyance should not be present in the most expensive bike radar in the market. Besides being a constant annoyance, the persistent false positives triggers the radar threat mode, which in turn reduces expected battery life. Costing twice as much, the RearVue 820 ought to be better than its predecessor in every facet. There are other Gen 1 competing radars with similar battery life, with USB-C charging, and with equally excellent radar performance as the older Varia radars. I personally have not tried the Lazine radar drive, but it has been reviewed positively by GP Llama. If you are still holding on to the RTL 515 with significantly diminished battery life, and you are sick of carrying a micro USB cable just to charge your only micro USB device, retailing at almost $180, the Lazine radar drive is a much cheaper replacement for the RTL 515.